replacements were to other people?
On one level they did, but you have to kind of go back to that time. For them, it was like by the time they signed to the major label with Tim, and the first record was really kind of an experiment. They were actually the first band sort of signed out of that environment. I mean, there was bands like Jason and the Scorchers who had development deals with EMI and other things, but of that kind of what we consider the classic indie rock period, they signed before Husker Du, they signed before REM, although REM was on IRS, and then made the move when it was time and most beneficial to them because they're very smart guys. But the replacements were just like, they were signed in '85, and so they were like the first ones. And so I think like it took a while for them to really realize like what was going on. And of course, by the time they signed to Warner Brothers for Tim, Bob was already on the way out. So the band was already like in this incredible state of flux, and which would continue over the next few albums. So it was every record, if you look really closely, except for maybe Stink and Sorry Ma, which are kind of almost of a piece and recorded very soon after each other, every record is different and is a reaction to the previous record. And in many cases has a different lineup, so it's almost like their evolution was like this constant thing, which, you know, wasn't by design or anything. And so they never quite kind of were still enough or consistent enough to sort of build on those things. It's like they had a really great critical success with Tim, and they go to make Pleased to Meet Me, and they fire Bob, so they make that record as a three-piece. And then they have to get Slim in the band, and then by the time they make Don't Tell a Soul, there's so much money invested in them and so much expectation that the pressure really started to like crack Westerberg, and that's a band that's been around for 10 years, and they're seeing REM zoom past them and all these people zoom past them. So it's like they never quite had that like 2-album period where it's like, okay, we did this album and now we can like sort of break or do the right thing on this one, because there was chaos was kind of continual in their world for one reason or another.
I'm glad you mentioned REM. I was really, I think, not old enough to really be aware of this at the time, of how competitive those two were as entities. And that becomes sort of like this funny thread through the book. And then also the footage that we surfaced from MTV News around the time that Bob's book came out. He and I did an interview, and I looked in the MTV archives, and there was some very, like, everyone just sort of had like a sheen of Coke sweat. I can really understand why it never ran, but it's you know, like a 15,
with Kurt Loder.
It's like a 17-minute interview, and we clipped it to about 9. But you know, in it they're making jokes about like basically Peter Buck being like a shitty guitarist, and I mean they're making fun of Kurt and saying, you know, MTV is lying to them. I mean, you can really tell why it wasn't used. But go figure. But that you know, and that seems to be like this thread in the book, that they loved and hated REM. You can see that, and I'm curious what you think, how much of a role you think competition played in the development as a band, but also, you know, that there's even a sense of competition within the band. Whose band is this?
Right. That was the thing that surprised me a little bit in terms of not so much the internal but the external. It's like, yeah, you always hear about their rivalry with Husker Du, and that was a rivalry up to the point where both bands could kind of headline. But really, it was more other people sort of taking sides about like who's the better band. But Husker Du actually really brought them here to Chicago and kind of fostered them into the hardcore scene, and that really resulted in Stink in a way. It was their way of trying to compete with Husker Du. And Bob Mould and Paul actually later on, when Paul got married, they were sort of dinner companions. You know, Bob would bring his boyfriend and they would have dinner, so it was friendly. Whereas with REM, it was much more of a competitive thing, namely because Peter Jesperson, who had been working with the Replacements and who was like father, brother, wet nurse, everything else to them, he decided, I'm going to take a road gig, road managing REM for this one summer, and left the Replacements in the middle of tour and went to REM, ostensibly to learn the business because REM were ahead. But for people who are not trusting like Paul and Tommy and Bob, that was a very bad move, and it like wounded them, and they actually kind of took it out on them really for the next couple years. And then later, of course, you know, REM Replacements go to Warner Brothers, and they do Tim and they do Pleased to Meet Me, which was a little bit undercut, but they're about to sort of like the next record, we are going to be the focus of the company. And then what happens? REM, on a million-selling record, signs to Warner Brothers. You know, and so it sort of there was that sense, particularly with Westerberg, and there's a really kind of poignant quote at the end where I'm talking about Westerberg at the low ebb of his Warner Brothers solo career in '96, where he says, you know, people are asking him about REM, and this was at the time that REM leveraged a very good situation because Warner Brothers was falling apart and they had their contract up for renewal, so they got $80 million deal, and this is the point where Westerberg's basically going to be off the label, and he says in the book, he says, or this was an interview at the time, he said, yeah, I've had to talk about them in every interview since 1983, and they don't have to talk about us anymore. They won. So he did see it almost as this kind of pitched battle, which you don't think of Westerberg or the Replacements. You think of them as devil may care, they don't give a fuck, whatever. But they were way more competitive than I ever realized, and that was a kind of a revelation. How much that rivalry with REM, spoken or unspoken, sort of dictated a lot of the things they did, including really kind of going for it with Don't Tell a Soul, which is kind of their least regarded record, largely because of the mix, but it was at a point where REM had sold 1 million records and the game had completely changed for bands of that nature, and at that level it's like, okay, it's not just like you're going to get critical reviews and sell 200,000-300,000 records, like this is the bar now, and of course that pissed them off too. So that was one thing that really surprised me, is just how competitive they were start to finish.
And what about within the context of the band?
That was always, there was a lot of things there. When Paul joined the band, and Paul was the lead guitar player, kind of wanting to be a songwriter and frontman, when he joined the Stinson Brothers and Chris Mars, who were then playing as Dog Breath, which is not a band name that probably would have taken them very far. But Chris Mars was kind of writing the songs. There were much of songs, they were kind of sort of, songs with a lot, as Paul put it, songs with a lot of stops and starts. But for Paul, like, he'd been playing in cover bands all these years, and he's like, well, this is just like trying to learn cover material, prog material that people have been forcing me to play in Richfield, Minnesota. He's like, I don't want to do that. So that's really was the impetus. When Paul came into the band, he had probably written a total of, I would say, 3 songs. Probably 1 instrumental and 2 songs with lyrics, which is "Looking for You," which kind of became Love Lines. He wasn't a songwriter. Within 3 months of meeting Westerberg, of the Stinson Brothers and Chris Mars, he'd probably written 30, very quickly 40, 50 songs. He was sort of inspired by the sort of desperation and chemistry they had, but also by the fact that he couldn't play other people's material in that way, like learn my songs and do it. So from the start, Chris Mars sort of moved out of the role of the songwriter, which festered for many, many years, I think. And then, of course, initially the sort of union of Bob and Paul was the power of the band, because Tommy was just a kid, and they were both desperate to sort of transcend their situations. I mean, they each had, Bob obviously had a very troubled and traumatic childhood. Paul had his own sort of demons in terms of, growing up in an alcoholic and depressive household. And these were guys, as Paul said, there wasn't a high school diploma or a driver's license between them. Like, literally, they all dropped out of high school. None of them could drive. Chris at one point had a motorcycle license until he lost it. And so, like, when that's your baseline, it's like, what can you do? They literally couldn't get to the gigs. I mean, the first couple gigs, they sort of scared up rides, and then, lo and behold, Peter Jesperson came into the picture. But, Paul and Bob, being older, knew, like, this is it. And that's why the first chapter, or the first section of the book, is called Jail, Death, or Janitor. When they asked Westerberg, what would your life have been without this band? He said, jail, death, or janitor. And that's that's actually true. A lot of bands kind of sort of say that this was our only option, but in their case, particularly at that time, maybe Paul could have been some kind of lifelong government employee. His brothers worked at the post office all his life. But I don't see, Tommy probably would have gone to prison, or sales, one of the two. And I'm sure Bob's life would have been, even shorter than it was. Chris might have survived somehow, but, I don't think he would have had the flourishing art career he has now. So it's like, when that's the reality, it's a pretty profound thing, and it was profound for them. And I think that's why they came together so quickly. I mean, they were almost fully formed by this shared sense of desperation from the go.
Well, and also, Minneapolis at the time, and you get into this in one of your chapters, about how there really wasn't anything nearing a developed music scene.
Right.
That basically, everyone was hitting their stride, and national visibility at around the same time with, sort of right in the wake of Let It Be.
Right.
Just sort of everyone having this big moment. But it wasn't like there was any real infrastructure when your biggest rock band is like the suburbs.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Minneapolis, and that became a really interesting part of it, just in terms of culturally and regionally. I mean, Minneapolis was a really thriving rock city in the 60s, with Castaways, the Garage Rock, and the studios were going, and of course Dylan had passed through town, and it was this weird. By the 70s, it was this weird thing where there was no original live music. It was all cover bands and show bands in the clubs. What had once been progressive radio was gone. And so what we know is kind of the birth of the Minneapolis scene. Suicide Commandos, eventually Suburbs, Curtis A., all that stuff. That was literally guys getting together at Orphope Joke Opus and saying, we need to start a scene. And so we'll start canvassing these bars that'll let us play. And then soon after, Jay's Longhorn opened up and all this stuff. And the Replacements were kind of outside of that, but they sort of walked into a situation that was just about the pop. And so it is kind of interesting. It's like these guys were just sort of on the outside, almost like waiting for everything to come together. And the timing, and the sort of fortuitous timing in the Replacement story, just not with them, but also with what was going on in the city of Minneapolis, had a lot to do with, the success that they did achieve.
And obviously their success helped accelerate a lot of the things that came in their wake.
Sure.